What if I told you that the entire global economy, every dollar in your wallet, every digit in your bank account, was invented by a convicted murderer and a professional gambler on the run? Most of you believe that money is something managed by serious men in suits. But 300 years ago, in the candlelit corridors of a bankrupt France, a man named John Law proved that you don't need gold to run an empire. You only need illusion. He didn't just invent a bubble, he invented the blueprint for the trap you are living in today. Welcome to the Mississippi Bubble. This is the story of the first time humanity agreed to trade their reality for a dream, only to wake up in a nightmare. A nation in ashes. The year is 1715. France is the most powerful nation on earth, but it is rotting from the inside. King Louis XIV has died, leaving behind a debt so massive it would take centuries to repay. The people are starving, the silver has vanished, and the economy is frozen in a liquidity crisis. Enter John Law, a brilliant mathematician who killed a man in a duel in London and escaped prison. He arrives in Paris not with an army, but with an idea. The wealth of a nation is not in its gold, but in its credit. He convinced the desperate Duke of Orleans that gold was a limitation. He argued that if the government could simply print the value of its future, the debt would vanish. It was the original free lunch. And in their desperation, the French elite handed a murderer the keys to the royal mint. The birth of the paper mirage. In 1716, Law established the Banque Générale. For the first time, people were encouraged to trade their heavy, clunky silver coins for light, convenient paper notes. Law promised that these notes were redeemable for gold at any time. At first, it felt like magic. The economy roared to life. Trade increased. People felt rich. But Law had a second act. He created the Mississippi Company, a giant monopoly that supposedly owned the infinite riches of the Louisiana Territory in the New World. He told the people of France that the ground in Louisiana was paved with gold and emeralds. He didn't have to show them the gold, he just had to sell them the story. He issued shares in the company, and he allowed people to buy those shares using the paper money he was printing. Think about that. He printed the money to buy the shares of a company that owned a land he had never seen. It was the world's first infinite feedback loop. The frenzy of the millionaires. In 1719, Paris became a madhouse. The term millionaire was literally invented to describe the commoners who were getting rich overnight by trading Mississippi shares. People sold their houses, their jewelry, and their family land just to get more paper. The price of a single share went from 500 livres to 10,000 livres in a matter of months. Waiters became aristocrats. Beggars became kings. John Law was the most powerful man in the world. He was the alchemist who had finally turned leaden debt into golden paper. But as the printing presses ran 24 hours a day to keep up with the demand, the value of the paper began to disconnect from the reality of the earth. The Louisiana gold didn't exist. It was a desert, a swamp, a lie. The modern mirror. If this sounds familiar, it should. We live in a world of Mississippi shares. We have paper dollars backed by nothing but faith. We have tech stocks valued at billions with zero profit. We have digital assets that promise infinite returns. John Law didn't just scam France in 1720. He taught the central bankers of 2026 how to manage a population through euphoria. But as the archives show us, every bubble has a pin. And the pin for John Law was the one thing he couldn't print: truth. The peak was reached. The streets were paved with paper gold. But then, one man, a prince, decided he wanted his real money back. He took a wagon to the bank and demanded his paper be turned back into physical gold. In part 2, we look at the day the music stopped. We will reveal the brutal collapse of the Mississippi scheme, the riots in the streets of Paris, and how John Law's paper paradise turned into a funeral pyre for the French Empire. The crack in the glass. By early 1720, the Mississippi bubble was so large that it blotted out the sun. But the problem with a system built on faith is that it only takes one person to stop believing. That person was the Prince de Conti. Annoyed that he couldn't get the shares he wanted, the prince sent 3 massive wagons to John Law's bank. He didn't want more paper. He demanded his notes be converted into solid gold and silver. Law was horrified. He knew that if the prince took his gold, others would follow. This was the first glitch in the matrix. The prince got his wagons filled, but the seeds of doubt were planted. The elite began to realize that while they were paper millionaires, the vault was dangerously empty. The criminalization of reality. As more people began to follow the prince's lead, John Law did something that would echo through history, foreshadowing the events of 1933. To protect his paper illusion, he made it illegal for any citizen to own more than 500 livres worth of gold or silver. He authorized house-to-house searches. Informers were paid to snitch on neighbors who were hoarding real money. Law was trying to force a nation to accept his paper by making the alternative a crime. It was a desperate move by a desperate man. He even tried to devalue gold by decree, hoping people would run back to his paper. But you cannot decree value into existence when the stomach is empty and the trust is gone. The chaos at Rue de Quincampoix. The street where the wealth of France was traded, Rue de Quincampoix, turned from a place of dreams into a battlefield. As the share prices began to wobble, the millionaires realized their paper fortunes were evaporating. The government tried to set a floor for the price, but the market didn't care. Panic is a fire that feeds on its own oxygen. People who had sold their ancestral lands for paper were now standing in the mud, holding scraps of ink that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Riots broke out. The very people who had worshipped John Law as a god months earlier were now screaming for his head. The printing press escalation. Law's final solution was the same one used by central banks today: print more. He believed that if he flooded the market with even more paper, he could buy the stability of the system. In 1720 alone, the money supply of France doubled. But money is like a shadow. If you stretch it too thin, it disappears. Inflation exploded. The price of basic goods rose by 100% in weeks. The paper was everywhere, but the value was nowhere. John Law had successfully turned the wealthiest nation in Europe into a house of cards, and the wind was picking up. The modern echo: liquidity injections. When you see the Federal Reserve injecting liquidity into the markets today, remember John Law. They are using the same 300-year-old play. They are trying to solve a crisis of trust with a surplus of paper. But history is a cruel judge. In 1720, the French people learned that a government can print currency, but it cannot print purchasing power. When they learned that when the elite tell you to stay in the system, it's usually because they are the ones looking for the exit door. The bubble didn't just pop, it disintegrated. France was left in a state of economic trauma that would eventually lead to a bloody revolution. But what happened to the man who started it all? In part 3, we look at the exile of the alchemist. We will reveal the final fate of John Law, the complete erasure of the Mississippi Company, and the haunting lesson that every modern investor needs to learn before the next 1720 happens to us. The ashes of the paper dream. By the end of 1720, the dream was over. The paper notes that had once been traded for gold in estates were now literally being used as wallpaper. The government, in a final act of desperation, admitted the banknotes were worthless. They had printed billions of livres against zero silver. The Mississippi Company, once the most valuable entity on the planet, was exposed as a hollow shell. No gold came from Louisiana. No emeralds arrived from the swamps. The only thing the company actually produced was a mountain of unpayable debt. The first great experiment in fiat currency had ended exactly how every fiat experiment in history ends, with the total destruction of the common man, ines labor. The alchemists escape. John Law, the man who was once worshipped as the savior of France, was now the most hated man in Europe. His windows were smashed by angry mobs. His life was in constant danger. In December 1720, disguised as a commoner and stripped of his titles, the man who invented modern finance fled Paris in a simple carriage. He left behind a nation in ruins. He spent his final years in Venice, a broken gambler, still writing letters to the French government, trying to explain that his math was correct and that it was the people's fear that had failed him. He died in poverty in 1729, but while the man died, his ghost remained. He had proven that for a few brief years, you could run a global superpower on nothing but a shared delusion, the century-long scar. The Mississippi bubble didn't just break the economy, it broke the French soul. For the next 80 years, the French people refused to touch paper money or trust a central bank. This trauma led to the stagnation of their economy, which eventually paved the road to the French Revolution. When people have their life savings stolen by an invisible printing press, they don't just get angry, they get violent. The guillotines of 1789 were fed by the financial lies of 1720. The archives show us a clear warning. When you disconnect money from reality, you eventually disconnect the government from the people. The Modern Mirage, 2026. We are now living in the great Mississippi of the 21st century. Image, a split screen showing a 1720 Mississippi share certificate on one side and a modern venture capital logo on the other. Our central bankers are the students of John Law. They use the same language: liquidity, stimulus, soft landing. So they tell you that debt is wealth and that the printing press is a tool for prosperity. But as we look into the currency archive, we see the same patterns returning, the same infinite feedback loops, the same criminalization of gold and silver. We are in the final stages of the cycle. The paper is everywhere, the trust is evaporating, and the wagons are starting to move toward the vault. The final verdict: stay physical. John Law's mistake was thinking he could beat the math of truth. He thought he could replace the value of the earth with the will of the state. He failed. History is a circle. The exit door from the Mississippi bubble was physical gold and silver. The exit door today remains the same. The alchemists will always try to turn your time into their paper. Your only defense is to hold something they cannot print, cannot delete, and cannot lie about. The Mississippi archive is now closed, but the lesson is yours to keep. The alchemist has fled, but the press is still running. Will you stay for the crash, or will you find the exit before the music stops? Stay physical. Stay sovereign. Thank you for watching the biggest scam in human history.